Welcome to the Voice of MPE, the official podcast of Merchant Payments Ecosystem, Europe's largest merchant payments conference. This podcast brings you interviews with payment industry leaders and professionals from the entire payment world. For more information, head over to www.merchantpaymentsecosystem.com. Today, we are going to talk about Payment Services Directive and Payment Services Regulations with host Jimmie Franklin from Vixio, who will be speaking to Nilixa Devlukia from Payment Solved and Emilio Rocchi from LexisNexis. Dive into the massive and very complex discussion, or rather brainstorming, about regulation, open banking, fraud, AI evolution, and biometrics technology, all of which impact payment regulations.
We are in Berlin for Merchant Payment Ecosystem, and we are going to be talking about the Payment Services Directive and Payment Services Regulation, or PSD3 and PSR. There are now plenty of PSRs around. There's the Payment Systems Regulator K, the Payment Services Regulation K, and also the Payment Services Regulation in the EU, and that's the one that we're going to be talking about today. I am Jimmie, and I will be the host of this podcast, and I work with Vixio Regulatory Intelligence. And at Vixio, we basically focus on the fintech solutions or the solutions that you guys sometimes need when it comes to regulation, whether that's PSD2, the AML directives, GDPR, DORA, or MiCA as well. There's lots of regulation going around at the moment if you're in payments. I'd like to now pass to Nilixa, who ironically was one of the first people I ever discussed open banking with. So Nilixa, the floor is yours.
Jimmie, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's interesting that you say I was one of the first persons you interviewed on open banking, because we're going to be talking about open banking again today.
Hurrah.
I'm Nilixa Devlukia from Payment Solved, a consultancy providing regulatory advice on open banking, payment services and digital assets to industry and regulators, including central banks. I am also chair of the Open Finance Association, and hence the focus on open banking.
Emilio?
Hello, good morning, Jimmie. Thank you very much for this initiative, and I'm very thankful to be part of this podcast. My name is Emilio Rocchi. I'm director for market planning internationally, taking care of the payments strategy at LexisNexis Risk Solution.
Brilliant. So we certainly have some experts to speak to today. Now, I'd like to start with PSD2, because it's been 6 years since PSD2 came into place now? 7. Oh, God. It has been a while.
That's right.
It would be good to kind of cover, I guess, the weaknesses that have come up in PSD2, and then we can perhaps look at how PSD3 and PSR, when it comes to open banking, could improve the situation, let's say. Because I think so far, open banking, certainly I use it, but I don't think it's had the kind of like mass adoption that would hope it would have had by this point. So I wonder who would want to go first there, talking about PSD2.
Sure, I'll go first, Jimmie. Obviously, PSD2 was groundbreaking in the regulatory framework it put around open banking services, account information and payment initiation services. I think that the main criticism that we have, and which is remedied within the recent regulatory package, is that the implementation across Europe has resulted in fragmentation across the market. The implementation by the supply side of the market has not been good. It's resulted in poor customer journeys, poor outcomes, bad performance. And obviously, when you're looking at the fact that open banking services in the e-commerce space are competing with cards, then time, slickness of journey, customer experience are all crucial and vital. And obviously, we'll come to it. The payment services regulation looks to solve some of those problems. But I also think from a merchant perspective, there are wider issues in regarding strong customer authentication and how that's been implemented, how we look at the fact that SCA has been great in mitigating fraud, but obviously we've now seen this rise of authorized push payment fraud. We all know fraud doesn't go away, it just moves. And so we now need to think about that next iteration of fraud mitigation measures. And I say it often, but we need to look at, having a piece of regulation that's future-proofed. So taking what needs to be fixed in PSD2 too, but not just fixing, looking at what we need for the long term. This, again, when it's debated, is going to be around for a number of years. What do we want to achieve and how are we going to get there? I think is the lens that we need to look at when we look at this regulatory package.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I would agree with Nilixa, exactly your description of the scenario. I'm looking at what the PSD2 has brought, and open banking is one of the results of PSD2. But if you see compare the world 7 years ago to now, when it comes to fraud, it's a different world. So the payments ecosystem, it's more fragmented. We see more players, but the challenges that every single player in the ecosystem is facing, it's completely different from 7 years ago. And if we look at the fraud, we see, AI-driven fraud is picking up. Social engineering, APP fraud. There's so much also subtle ways to defraud a legitimate consumer that the traditional ways to combat and type of fraud, they are not working. And I cannot highlight it is enough to say we need collaboration among all the payment players within the ecosystem. So we at Nexus Risk Solutions, we believe that we offer a platform where everybody could share fraud intelligence and provide tools and strategies to combat this type of fraud. And it will get even harder if we do not collaborate among the players.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with fraud, it was interesting. I mean, I was covering SCA as it was being implemented in the EU. And then it was pretty much as soon as local regulators started saying this has been a success in reining in fraud, then it was like authorized push payment fraud started to go up. And I wonder, with the latest proposals, do you think that they appropriately tackle fraud issues, and are they going to be able to rein in things like impersonation fraud? I wonder as well, one of the proposals I think that the European Commission made in the PSR, they were talking about impersonation fraud. And we're seeing this rise of AI. Are we just going to see the same kind of problems coming up again once the PSR 1 comes into place?
I think we will. So if we do not prepare, it will get more tough. But we have the technology and we have the intelligence and we have data to combat that. And we have, so from our side, we also have artificial intelligence, we have machine learning, deep learning. But the thing, if we do not cooperate, that data becomes stuck in a silo. And the next player in the chain of whether it's a credit card processing or it's an open banking will not be able to act in real time. So I believe, we need to still, the regulation does not provide you per se a ready solution. We need to, I think, and this podcast is a part of brainstorming what we are going to do to solve this problem together. And the more the ecosystem hear the voice and the needs of each player, it's easier to implement that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder with open banking, is that a solution to be able to tackle fraud? Is there evidence of that so far?
Well, from my perspective, I think that open banking payment initiation payments are a good mitigant for fraud. And the reason for that is that when you're talking about payer to merchant payments, the information for the payment, the name of the payee, the account number, is pre-populated by the merchant. So you haven't got the manipulation risk because the PISP has a contract with the merchant, it has that information. And therefore, in that ecosystem, I actually don't think that enough is talked about in the fact that open banking payments can mitigate this type of fraud. But obviously, underpinning that, we need really good, well-functioning ecosystems, building upon instant payments, which is coming into effect later on this year, that provides that really good experience. I think the other thing, going back just to SCA, is that what we have at the moment has done a good job in mitigating fraud, but it's prescriptive. And when we look at the evolution of technology, AI, behavioral biometrics, that's the word I'm thinking of. Yes, biometrics. There needs to be flexibility. It shouldn't be about you have to do authentication this way. It should be about use the best authentication methods and let's look at what your fraud rates are. Let's mitigate fraud and really focus on the fact that fraud is going down and not be prescriptive on how you get there. Yeah. And I think, and particularly in this age of AI and evolution of technology, we need that flexibility in a regulatory regime. And I know it's easy to say, it's very hard to implement. because you have to be able to supervise it. With my, former regulatory hat, it's not easy, but having such a prescriptive way of doing things does mean that it's difficult for industry to move forward, innovate, and meet the challenges that are there.
Yeah, so I would just add the dynamic risk assessment, risk decisioning, and it will allow you to do adaptive authentication. And talking about the payer and payee, I think what PSD3 is talking about getting rid of the limitation for non-banking players like PSPs or neobanks to actually allow to add new beneficiaries and actually do transfer account to account, peer to peer, and even cross-border. I think that's where we are going. If you look at other regions like Asia, it's quite common that people, from Singapore, they do instant payment to, Hong Kong or to Malaysia. That's coming in Europe as well, but that requires even more intelligence because, I always call it instant payment. It's nice, but instant fraud will be a possibility as well. So once the funds are sent, there's no way to return. So that's bring us to another level of risk as well.
Absolutely. And I wonder, with the instant payment regulation, which has now been passed, and the PSR coming into force, hopefully in the next few years, depending on what happens with the elections and trilogues, God knows what. Do you think that the protection system is in place for instant payments to be a success and not have these kind of fraud problems like we have seen in the UK, obviously, for push payments? Do you think that it's in place in the EU?
Yeah, I think there's multiple variables. So depending where you're looking at, from which perspective, me being in European, I see we can rely on an infrastructure like IBAN and SEPA payments are there. Mm-hmm. So they are working. Now to do instant payment is to use a completely new infrastructure to allow those instant payment. But data and, bank account information, that data is there. Now it's about how you share that data, that private data from the consumers and bank account holders. I think it's where we need to do a trade-off between security, regulation, and convenience. Yeah. So GDPR could be, it's great that we have GDPR to protect the consumer, but it cannot be also, it could also be an obstacle for data sharing. So we need to find out that trade-off, how we protect and we are compliant, but also we are providing a seamless, convenient use case for consumers.
I think the other thing that we have to be mindful of is that fraud is a big issue, and it's incumbent on everybody in the ecosystem to work towards solutions. But we have this almost like a jigsaw of how do all the pieces fit together. And if I sort of talk through an open banking lens, we see these provisions, and particularly in the UK, which is like we've got fraud mitigation measures. We've now got a proposal out yesterday in the UK about slowing down faster payments from 1 day to 4 days. Haven't got my head round how it's a faster payment if it's 1 day to 4 days, but
you're not the only one.
But I think, at the same time, we have this narrative within Europe and the UK that we want account payments to flourish. We want to see open banking flourish. We want to see payment initiation flourish. But all these provisions, as you stack them together, has actually a detrimental impact on open banking payments, because it means they're not as slick. They're slow. They get held up. From a risk appetite perspective, depending on where the liability is going to land, and obviously it varies across jurisdictions, banks will not necessarily have the appetite to allow, say, higher value payments to flow. And therefore they stop those higher value payments. Now, all of that from a customer perspective means, why would I use this payment mechanism?
Right. Yeah. And let me jump in directly there. So those players that they really have a robust real-time risk and fraud solutions, behind it, there will be the ones sticking out, let's say, among all the players and providing a secure, seamless payment solution. So that's it. When risk become also a strength, we always saw fraud and prevention and risk prevention as something to do, but not very willing to, we have to do it. But now everybody understands it's a differentiator in the market when you can combine your proposition, your different payment options together with very robust risk fraud solution in place.
And that's right. But the thing in an open banking payments, it's not the PIS that's making the decision. It's the ASPSP that makes the decision as to whether that payment is going to flow or not. And therefore, that's that imbalance. And that's where I think we need to be cautious about when we think about what is the impact of this fraud mitigation measure, what is the impact then on an open banking journey? What's the impact on customers? And actually, what are you solving for? And I know this is a UK example, but the data, when we look at how liability for authorized push payment fraud is landed, the data that's coming out of industry is that it's a hammer to crack a sort of nut sort of approach, because it's going to possibly stop payments from flowing. And yet the loss is in only a small percentage of those payments that may get stopped. So you've got to look at proportionate responses. And then you've also got to look at, yes, we all agree we have to stop fraud and we have to have the right measures in place. But what does it mean holistically for the ecosystem? What does it mean for payments across Europe? You talked yourself about cross-border payments, Emilio, but yet IBAN discrimination, which has been, is unlawful.
Yeah. And
still happens.
And I think that's a real problem with, like Marie McGuinness, the European Commissioner, has now said, only at the very, very end of her mandate, has now said that she's very, very keen to tackle this. And I've been speaking to people about this for years, and I'm so surprised that it's still an issue that you have in, I suppose, single market.
Yeah, maybe we haven't mentioned yet that what weakest point in the whole chain and the whole ecosystem is the consumer. Yeah. Just want to hear from your side as well. And being traveling in other regions, education of the consumer. How we help consumers to be aware of new risk, fraud, how they use, open banking. I've seen, literally, I saw in Asian Singapore, government placing a lot of information in the street, at supermarkets. So I don't see it much on this side of the world.
I agree. I mean, are you talking about open banking or fraud?
Yes, both. Yeah. How do we educate consumer and make them aware of risks?
I think that's a real issue, actually, with open banking. The name, I think this in the UK in particular, can sometimes warrant some stigma. Like, I remember when I first found out what open banking was, when I was becoming a journalist, I really struggled with trying to process what it was, because you get told so often, never give your details away. I mean, I think when you see like open banking, you think, oh, I got some details, which obviously isn't the case.
Right, you feel unsafe from the very beginning.
Yeah.
So I think terminology is important. I personally have a slightly different view on consumer education, in that consumers, we don't educate consumers about payments.
Right.
Payments flow because consumers don't think about how the payment is being made. Obviously, to make an open banking payment is a choice, but if it works well and they can see that it works well and they're getting what they want from it, and we've got the framework in place for the protection that's there, then I'm not sure that we need to educate them on open banking. Yes, consumers need to be mindful of fraud risks, because that's across the board. But I think that the challenge you have that you just mentioned about open banking terminology, I think we've moved on from that personally. But I think that what we also need to think about is how the ecosystem works in the long run. So if you work on an API basis and you work in a sort of redirection model, no credentials are being shared. And that's something that I think is the right way forward. It's the future proofing of the legislation. And that's one of the main things that I would be saying needs to be changed in the current PSR. Right. In that it's got that contingency mechanism, which is just, in my view and an OFA view, it's just not the right outcome for how the industry should be moving forward.
Yeah. Right, and without mentioning names, I think we have in the market, in the ecosystem, certain business model. They call it these invisible payments. I remember the time of one-click payments, zero-click payments, and payments become invisible. Those models are working while the consumer feels really safe. They create an account in those platforms. They use the services, for example, sharing, ride sharing, and they don't even feel that they are paying, but they really trust solutions. So I don't think those are kind of islands of ideal models that would be nice to see across the whole ecosystem, where in open banking, you also feel safe. And your payments become it's an embedded service, is embedded in your day-to-day life, and you're not feeling, you need to double check, are my credentials being shared? I am at risk. Is there a potential account takeover? So I think we have incipient examples, but certain business models, they already implemented these invisible payments. But of course, behind that, there is a lot of investment in, data analytics, behavioral biometrics, a lot of multi-layer holistic fraud solution that allows that model to offer to the consumer kind of an invisible payment. And that's what I would like to see in the future, that this go across all different industries and channels.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're coming up to the end of the podcast now, sadly. I feel like with this issue, you can talk for hours on it. But it would be good to know from both of you, as I think the Econ Committee has now voted on their position on the PSD3 and PSR. The next vote is happening at plenary in April. And then, we're also going to see the Council's position begin to emerge. What kind of things do you think, if they need to make any improvements to PSR, PSD3, so that this is a long-lasting and successful piece of legislation, what would you like it to be?
Yeah, I would say, again, insist on the collaboration on fraud intelligence, data sharing. We do have already the technical the technology available to make that happen. But of course, we need to have from all players. They need to have the visibility, transparency, what you're doing with the data. But I think we need to insist on that data sharing for tackling fraud is essential. It's key.
Brilliant. And Nilixa?
I suppose there's about 3 things on my wish list. The high level ones anyway. No fallback mechanism. We don't need it. API only. Metrics for API performance, and then better enforcement by regulators of the regulations that are actually in place to make sure that we have a well-functioning open banking ecosystem.
So, well, thank you both so much for coming along today. And I hope that everyone has had a fantastic time at Berlin. I'm Jimmie, and I've thoroughly podcast. So take care, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in to the official MPE podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the show and check other video interviews with other industry leaders on our YouTube channel. For more content, follow Merchant Payments Ecosystem on LinkedIn and Twitter. Don't miss out on our Positivity magazine, and remember to subscribe to the MPE newsletter at www.merchantpaymentsecosystem.com.